Hello, this is Geology Basics video mini lecture number 3, the process of science. And specifically, we're discussing what makes something scientific. In this video, we're going to focus on what makes something scientific. In the following 2 video mini lectures, we're going to discuss what is science and then what's a scientific theory versus a scientific hypothesis. This video mini lecture focuses on what makes something scientific, and specifically we're going to be working on answering questions or what scientific questions are. So we're going to start with the main definition of science as involving asking and answering questions about the natural universe. So one way to get at what makes something scientific is to try to list at least 3 criteria that define a scientific question.
Here are 9 questions, some of which are scientific and some of which are not. Take a minute or two, consider which of the questions are likely scientific, and jot down ideas about what makes them scientific. Pause the video while you work on answering these questions, and play it again when you're ready to check your answer and your thinking. Scientists would consider 5 of these questions scientific, and they're highlighted in green. So they include, how did the Earth form? How old is the Earth? Were the continents together in the past and then separated? Where are sapphire crystals found? And why do volcanoes erupt? So what makes them scientific? It turns out they each fit 3 criteria that mean they're scientific. So let's take a look at these questions again. These are all scientific questions because they have 3 things that you can say is true about them that relate to science. The first is that for each question, geologists can make observations and collect data as evidence to test their hypotheses. So hypotheses would be a potential answer, or a hypothesis would be a potential answer to each of these questions. Each question might have its own hypothesis. So, where are sapphire crystals found, for example? Geologists can make observations about where sapphire crystals have been found in the past and then collect data on that to test their hypotheses, whatever explanation one would think might be true. The second criterion is that geologists use logic to determine the most reasonable and simplest hypothesis that can answer the scientific question. It's answerable by logic, by reasoning that people consider to be logical. The last is that geologists can use the answers or supported hypotheses that explain the questions to make predictions for the future or for other situations. So back to the sapphire crystals, if we had an idea of where they've been found, we might be able to have an explanation for how they form. And then be able to predict where we might find some in the future by understanding where rocks that form with sapphire crystals are found in other places. What about these other questions? What's the purpose of the shape of the continents? What is the meaning of volcanic eruption? Did a divine being create Earth? What does ruby mean as a gift? These are all fairly interesting questions, and some of them might be pretty important to you, but these questions are not scientific questions. We go back to those 3 criteria before. First, anyone cannot make observations and collect evidence to answer the questions. They're not evidence or observational-based questions. That is, those kinds of things aren't going to help us decide if they're true or find an answer to the questions. Second, a logical analysis of any data about these questions can't answer those questions. Third, the answers to the questions cannot be used to predict what might happen in the future or in other situations. So again, those 3 criteria have to do with making observations, collecting evidence that can be helped to answer the questions, that data in the form of observations can be used in scientific questions to answer them. And finally, there's a predictive value to the question in that we can answer the question and kind of try to figure out what might happen in the future based on the data. So let's review again. All the questions we looked at so far that we designated as scientific, These are all scientific for three reasons. First, geologists can make observations and collect data as evidence to test hypotheses. In this case, we mean a hypothesis would be a potential answer to a question. Geologists also use logic to determine the most reasonable and simplest hypothesis that would answer that scientific question. And third, geologists can use the answers to the questions or hypotheses that are supported by data to make predictions for the future or for other situations. So another version of scientific criteria include more about how science works or the process of science, and it's kind of another checklist. It's a little more complicated, and it doesn't just refer to questions. It refers to sort of any behavior or anything out there that you're wondering if it could be scientific. Is this a scientific kind of endeavor? So in this checklist, if a scientific problem, statement, question would focus on the natural world, it would aim to explain the natural world. It uses testable ideas, relies on evidence, involves the scientific community, and leads to ongoing research, and it benefits from scientific behavior. So it's scientists behaving as scientists. We're going to talk more about these ideas, and these aren't things to memorize, but things to keep in mind. The three criteria are things you're going to want to work towards remembering. Thanks, and see you again.